It is noon in the east. It is 9 a.m. in the west. It is Friday, January 28th, and that means it must be Lunch with Lincoln. Hey everyone, it's Galen here, co-founder of the Lincoln Project and your host for Lunch with Lincoln today. Welcome everyone. I hope everyone has had a good week and is looking forward to a safe and healthy weekend. Want to introduce my guest for today, Anna Scheumann. Anna is part of a couple of organizations related to Holocaust education and Holocaust remembrance. Anna is the grandchild of not one but two Holocaust survivors. So Anna, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And so yesterday was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So give us a little sense of what it was that your grandparents went through, a little bit about their story, and how you came to be so involved with the organizations that you are.
Well, both of my mother's parents, Max and Erna Hilfstein, they were from Cracow, Poland. And they were there. My grandfather was born in 1920. My grandmother was a couple years younger than that. So they were sent to the ghetto when they were late teens. My grandfather was early 20s.
Right.
And they saw a steady rise of anti-Semitism up to that point. There wasn't just a ghetto all of a sudden and concentration camps all of a sudden. It was a slow escalation. They were in the ghetto.
And this is in Poland.
Yeah. Sorry?
This is in Poland.
This is in Poland, yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously the escalation happened faster in Germany, and there were Jews killed much earlier in Germany, but anti-Semitism was always there. It was always persistent. My grandfather would talk about how he was a beautician, but as a trained boxer, that sometimes he would physically intervene when there were Jews being attacked on the streets.
Right. And so obviously the war between Germany and Poland really set off World War II writ large in Europe, September 1st, 1939. Where were your grandparents when the war started, and how long was it before, from the time of the invasion till they were in ghettos until they ended up in camps?
Well, here's a picture of, there's my grandfather is the older kid with his younger brother, David, who was killed, and his father, who died in 1934 when he was 14 years old. He would say that he was the lucky one because he didn't have to see what happened.
Right.
So before Germany invaded, my grandfather was about 18 and he joined the Red Cross. Mm-hmm. And he was helping to place German Jewish families that were being smuggled across the border into homes. And his family took in a family like that were trying to escape. On March 3rd in 1941 is when he and his family were ordered into the ghetto. So you leave your apartment, you could take only what you can carry, and you were moved into where you were assigned to live.
And this is in Cracow.
Yes. They were in the Cracow ghetto. Yeah. And they were there doing forced labor, really nice way of saying slave labor, whatever they were told to do. My grandfather had to continue operating his family's salon because the Nazi officers and their wives need to keep looking good. He also had to do everything from cut bricks to shave the heads of people going into a small hospital they would set up for typhus so that it wouldn't spread through lice. And he had to carry furniture out of the ghetto.
Right. So then at what point, where did your grandparents end up? What camp did your grandfather end up in, and what camp did your grandmother end up in?
So after the liquidation of the Cracow ghetto, where people were either killed on the spot and the remaining several thousand were taken out, they went to Plaszow concentration camp, which was just on the outskirts of Cracow.
Right. And they were there. They were at the same camp all the way through the end of the war?
No, they were together at Plaszow, which they called a work camp, but it was, people died daily. People were tortured to death by work,
Right.
by freezing outside in the cold. They were there until the Russians were encroaching, and so they wanted to liquidate the camp. And they tried to dismantle as much of the camp as they could, because the idea was to erase any evidence that this had happened. So my grandfather's last task there was actually to dig up the bodies of Jews from a mass grave and take them to be burned.
Right.
And then they were sent on a death march to Auschwitz. So they both were together walking through in January in winter and freezing cold, walking 50 plus miles through the countryside to Auschwitz. And they were there together you're separated into the men and women when you get there. My grandmother was only there for a couple of days before being sent over to Bergen-Belsen, which is where she was liberated from. And my grandfather was on cattle cars, just being sent to camp after camp after camp until the train tracks were bombed ahead of him.
Right. So one thing, and Anna is on, Anna and I have a longer conversation, folks, on our podcast that just dropped today. So please tune into that as well. But, Anna, one of the things that you told me during that conversation that I hadn't really considered, and I've spent more than my fair share of time, reading about World War II, studying it. I have two grandfathers that fought in it. Was that your grandparents were in displaced persons camps until late 1950? More than 5 years after the war ended. So while the terror and the miraculous nature of them surviving, got them to the middle of 1945, it was another 5 years of being in one camp or another.
Yeah, well, this idea that it just ended, there was no life to go back to.
Right.
There were other people. My grandfather tried to go back home. There was another family living in his apartment. They wouldn't open the door. Mm-hmm. My grandmother's childhood home is now a bank. You were stateless. You didn't have citizenship anywhere. You had no money. You had nothing. So you were directed, the UN set up these displaced persons camps, and they were there for a while until they had taken over a small German town next to where they were called Galen, and they were assigned an apartment, but you still couldn't just leave. When my grandmother had my uncle in 1946, they had to have a letter from the French army, which was in charge of that area, to give my grandfather permission to take her to the hospital. When my grandfather located my grandmother at the DP camp at Bergen-Belsen, he had to have a letter giving him permission to travel to go get her.
Right. And so how did they make it to the U.S.?
So they ended up being sponsored by a distant cousin, and they came to New York by way of Boston.
Okay. And you mentioned that initially a lot of folks were trying to get to Israel. A lot of that was blocked for various political reasons at the time. So they make their way here, make their way to Boston, and then ultimately to New York. So tell me about your experience with them as what you call a 3G, and that's one of your organization's 3GNY, third generation of a member of family who survived the Holocaust. So tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up with grandparents who had this experience.
Well, it was always a part of my upbringing. That wasn't true for all survivors' families, but for me, their stories were always there. I don't remember a time where I didn't know that they were Holocaust survivors. And I spent a lot of time, around my grandparents and their friends. Like, these weren't cousins. These are not relatives. We had very little of that. It was other survivors from the region. And my grandfather helps to found an organization, the new Cracow Friendship Society. The object is that 90% of all Polish Jews were killed, and they needed a sense of community. So I grew up going to these parties and events that were nothing but survivors and their children, raising money for various charities and dancing to live music. But their experience has, it's shaped how I view the world and how I react to things now. The things that I find particularly scary now are because of them and their experiences.
So, I mean, I would venture to say that having been through something like that, obviously shaped your grandparents and all the other survivors forever, and their families as well. It sounds like, though, that they, even after this the indescribable experience that they both had, they came to this country, they made a life for themselves, they created a family for themselves. Did it haunt them? Did it, was it something that they had, was it talking about it, being with the other survivors? Was that a means of therapy for them? Sharing those stories with you? Like, give me a sense of how does someone who's been through that, I guess, live their daily lives? Because I mean, none of us can even imagine it.
To be honest, I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they could lose everything and be tortured and beaten and starved and then go on to have careers and family and have joy. But my grandfather would say many, many times, it happened before, it can happen again.
Right.
That they were really thankful they could be here, and this was the greatest place in the world, but it could happen again, and it could happen anywhere.
So you've taken, what they passed on to you, both through their individual stories and obviously your relationships with them. And so now you are a Holocaust educator. So tell us a little bit about your organization and the kind of work you do.
Yeah, so through 3GNY, 3Gs, we are often the last living link to survivors and their stories. So what we do is you can request our 350 plus trained speakers to come to a classroom in person or digitally, and we tell our grandparents' story. So, usually the classroom, they're either reading, hopefully, a book about, the Holocaust, or they're in their World War II studies, and we provide a human face, because otherwise it's just dates and numbers and statistics. But when you learn about a person's story, you can create that empathetic connection between all these figures and an actual real person.
Right. And so what, when you go to teach one of these classes, school age kids, I assume, some younger, some in high school, what's the reaction? I mean, if you've been to a Holocaust museum, DC, Yad Vashem, Los Angeles, wherever it is, I remember when I first went, I think I was 17, and even at 17, you can't really intellectualize the scope, right? It's just so. What's the reaction you see from kids when you teach these classes?
You can see that you affect them. Sometimes you see kids, their jaws drop open, or they look shocked, or sometimes they cry. And we provide a age appropriate story, and everywhere from 5th grade up. But we don't sanitize the details, because that would not be the truth. And afterwards, you have kids that ask a lot of really insightful questions, and often hearing a story first, then they want to know, well, how could this possibly happen? And it makes them more curious to learn about the truth and the facts and how things come about. I mean, the question that I get asked the most is, well, why do you do this? It's such a painful story. It's obviously very emotional. It's emotional to tell it. And I told the high school class once, like, well, I want you to get pissed off. I want you to look at the world around us and see all the things that are just wrong in it. And I want you to do something about it. I want you to be motivated to, when you see something that seems off, you don't wait till it gets violent.
Right.
You do something then. You become an upstander.
Yeah, and that was something we talked about on the podcast too. So there's the notion of everybody knows what a bystander is, right? Innocent bystander, standing there on a street when a car accident happens, right? Oh, it was a bystander. It was a terrible accident. An upstander, though, is something where the bystander is entirely passive and it's by accident that they might be where they are, takes no action, regardless of what it is they see. The upstander, on the other hand, though, either because of or in spite of their discomfort or fear, does something, says something, gets up and says like no more, or this isn't right. And it feels like, Anna, that we have a lot of those, but it sure feels like we need a lot more. Because I mean, you think about it, the stuff that your grandparents went through and that you still teach today, this isn't like Louis the 14th. This isn't ancient Rome or ancient Egypt. This stuff happened 80 years ago, right? This is, as you said, my grandparents have now all passed on. I believe yours have as well. But there are still members of that generation alive today.
Yeah.
And the idea that there is so little understanding of it, or that so many people, flat out deny it, right? Or use it to somehow say, well, they go to a school board meeting with a yellow star on and says, oh, well, my kid's got to wear a mask, so I'm going to wear a yellow star because I'm somehow oppressed, right? Like it's a fascinating thing to see how quickly human memory fades, but for the kind of work that you all do.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing, is that the Holocaust is still in living memory. People are still alive to tell their stories. And as 3Gs, we're realizing that generation is dwindling, and it's up to us. And when people think of upstanders, like there's lots of different types of activism. Okay, you don't have to be marching on the street with the sign if that's not your thing. There are lots of different ways to stand up for other people and make sure that they're seen. I mean, we're on the heels of a pretty major anti-Semitic incident, a hostage situation.
Right.
What are you doing about that? There are people that now they're volunteering to provide security for Jewish organizations, or sometimes it's a matter of making a phone call. What do you need?
Right.
How can we help?
Well, we were talking about this last week, and I think earlier this week. You go to your average Presbyterian church, your average Episcopalian church, Lutheran, most of your, let's call it any Christian denomination and Protestant denomination. Like, you park in the parking lot, you go into the church, you sit down, you have your service, maybe there's a coffee break, and you leave, right? You go to almost any synagogue or Jewish community center, there's security outside. When I lived in San Francisco, the Jewish Community Center in downtown San Francisco, if you wanted to park in the garage, like, they ran a mirror underneath your car, right? This is not the same kind of deal. It is a distinct and centuries long sort of process that sort of always finds, it's like the roots shrivel, but they never die in anti-Semitism. Does that make sense? That somehow somebody always comes back to water it again.
It's always, anti-Semitism is always there if you want a small minority to blame society ills on. There's, because there's a cabal of Jews that run everything. That's the prevalent underlying thing that always exists. And you're right. And the security, that's not new. Like, right. Long before there was the shooting in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, right. There's been security. If you go to the YMCA to work out, is there security walking in? There's security at a JCC though.
Right.
So it's, and most people, I don't think they realize that.
Well, and then, there's what we see from elected members of our government, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, accused Jewish space lasers of starting forest fires or wildfires in California.
That was a creative one.
Just, was it last week, I think, Lauren Boebert, she and Green and Gosar and a few of these other people tied for the worst people ever elected to office in the United States, regardless of what level it is. Saw some gentlemen wearing yarmulkes coming out of an elevator on a tour, and looked at them and said, "Are you guys here doing reconnaissance?" As if the four Jewish guys in the elevator were somehow plotting an attack on the Capitol. Ironically enough, maybe it was projection, Anna. maybe it was because
right?
he was in trouble, and the first one. But it's the issue I'm concerned about is that it's seeping back into the mainstream. Maybe not seeping. Maybe it's not a flood. Maybe it's not a seep, but it is a flow back into the mainstream.
Yeah, these ideas are not fringe. If you know what to listen for, you can hear anti-Semitism all the time. I mean, how many times have you heard that George Soros has orchestrated something? I mean, that just plays into the anti-Semitic trope of Jews controlling all the wealth and being puppet masters. I mean, you can hear almost nightly Tucker Carlson talking about replacement theory, which
Right.
isn't just that minorities are taking over, it's that Jews are orchestrating that.
Right. I mean, so I want to let me flip back to education for a second, because this is the other front line of this, where you're bringing, intellectual and educational freedom, is now coming, is now mixing with anti-Semitism, whether it's implicit or explicit. We see that there was a school district in North Texas that said that if you're going to teach the history of the Holocaust, you have to teach both sides. In Florida, there's a bill going through the legislature. This isn't about anti-Semitism, but it is about race. That you can't teach anything that might make white students feel uncomfortable. There was I think it was a Tennessee school district that said that the graphic novel Mouse, which is obviously a recreation of the Holocaust through a graphic novel I read in high school for the first time, has now been banned because it might make people uncomfortable. So these are the kinds of things that start what seemingly from the ridiculous to the malignant in a hurry. You're going to teach both sides of the Holocaust. Like, that's the concept of such an equivalency to me is appalling. But here we are.
It is appalling. And I mean, and Mouse just getting banned because it makes students uncomfortable, because it had nudity. It depicts mice as Jews and cats as Nazis. Okay, we're talking about an illustrated mouse nipple.
Right.
Okay, to 14-year-olds.
Right.
So it
assuming they've never taken a shower.
Yeah. So and it's about, like, this is the point where we have to say, no, if learning about the history makes us uncomfortable, what does that say? Why are you uncomfortable?
Mm-hmm.
And then sit with that discomfort for a minute and then learn about it. We did send letters yesterday, 3JNY, to every single member of that school board district, offering our speakers to come in and tell their families' stories in an appropriate manner, and we hope they take us up on it.
Well, and I think that's true too. B, can we run the URLs of Anna's group so we can make sure folks can get involved? And I would say this too, gang, is that if you live in one of these districts, call your school district, call your school board and say, this is the kind of education we think we need. History is rarely supposed to make you feel better about things. History is supposed to be a guide and a teacher. There's the old trope, those that ignore history are doomed to repeat it. I prefer, history doesn't rhyme, but it does echo, right? That there are clearly things that we see in our recent past that we should say, well, the circumstances of how we got here, Anna, are not the same, right? But the circumstances of the types of people involved are all very similar, right? The strong man always has the same type of traits. His inner circle always has the same type of traits. We saw in the last, again, this is not ancient history, in the last 100 years, right? Democracies far more often fail through democratic means than they ever do from coups, right? It's rarely the tanks rolling. It's people going to the ballot box, or as we've seen in Georgia, where they're changing voting laws and to make things, whether or not that's how people participate or how votes are counted, that you could say, well, it's technically legal, but it's not democratic. And so the idea of, this is what happens when a democratic system is weakened, is that the norms that we're used to, the traditions that we're used to, and the types of people who are coming to office do not uphold those institutions and that faith and belief in democracy, but now start to twist it for their own purposes. And again, we've seen how this stuff ends up, right? And it rarely ends up well.
Yeah. Well, that's what's so important about Holocaust education, is because we're talking about, a modern, advanced society, and this is what happened.
Right. I mean, I'm just looking at the chat here, Anna, and somebody put in the chat, are they going to teach 9/11 from both sides? Right? If somebody said we should teach 9/11 from the perspective of Osama bin Laden and Mohammed Atta, right, people would lose their freaking minds.
Right. So
right?
If you're not losing your freaking mind when somebody suggests we tell the Holocaust from the other side, you should be.
Right. If you're like, well, why don't we climb into the feelings and emotions of Adolf Eichmann as he created the train schedules on his way to Auschwitz, right? Like, really? That's what you're going to spend your time on? Spend some time with Hannah Arendt if you really want to know, what did she call him? The banality of evil, right? And so many of these people have, they're not, for folks that worked for Donald Trump in his government, in his politics, in his companies, whatever, they're not otherwise employable in any like normal political organization, normal business organization, because you have, just like with all these folks, you have to be willing to stoop to that level of amorality to be around them. And you have to say, yes, I'm okay with this. And I think that the good news is, Anna, I think even in these turbulent times, and they are turbulent, that there are far more folks who believe in decency, the brightness of the human spirit, and democracy than there are who don't.
And we just need those people to be upstanders.
That's right. So everybody, I want you to stand up. Stand up. We'll do that thing from Network, right? And say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. But before we go, everybody, we dropped a new ad yesterday commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So B, why don't we go ahead and run that, and then we will let everybody get to their weekend.
The new populist movement was loud and crude, led by a clownish figure. The propaganda networks of the party were ugly and deceptive, but no one really bought it, did they? Things could never go that far, right? It was all just politics. No one believed weaponized propaganda could take hold in a modern, educated nation and mark the Jewish people for death. No one imagined the power of the state would be harnessed for genocide, even if that was always the goal. Their democracy was messy but strong. At least that's what everyone thought. Those who spoke out, who warned of what was coming, were ignored. And then, almost overnight, democracy fell, and the lives of 6 million Jews were destroyed by charismatic madmen and their enablers. The loss and pain passed through the families of its victims for generations. As we mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the lessons of the past are powerful and present. Authoritarian movements of hate, anti-Semitism, and the violent pursuit of power are on the march again. Enemies of freedom, of democracy, of hope and humanity. The world made a promise of never again. It's up to us to keep it.
Well, Anna, I want to thank you again for your time this week. You have been instrumental in not only this show today, our podcast, and also everybody, that ad that you just saw. Anna had a big hand in helping craft. Thank you for all the work you do. Thank you for carrying on both the words and the spirit of your grandparents and what they went through. Everybody, I want to say thank you so much. Everybody have a safe, healthy, and happy weekend. Anna, thanks again. And everybody, we'll see you on Monday. Take care.